Good morning. Welcome. Glad you're here. I hope you don't mind if I sit a little bit. My right knee gives me problems from time to time, and today it's given me a few problems. And so I'm going to sit here just to take some pressure off of it. Thanks for staying. Lee is sick this morning. Don't know what he has. He's tested negative for the flu, negative for COVID, but sometimes those tests don't come through early, and so please pray for him. Pray for Joan more than him probably, because she's got to nurse him. And so, Joan, what do you do for a living? You're a nurse. Okay, well, good. That'll be easy for you. All right, and I knew that, but she'll be nursing him back. Juanita's got COVID, and so Rodney's not here today because of that. So pray for Rodney that he can avoid COVID. Juanita's having a mild case. We're grateful for that. And so what wonderful couple they are. So they're not here today. And so I'll be tackling this by myself today, which is okay. We're in Genesis chapters 12 and 13, starting the story of Abram. And last week we had gotten to the Abrahamic covenant here in Genesis 12. God tells Abram to leave his land, his relatives, his father's house, to go to the land that he would show him. And then you have two verses that explain the covenant. And the covenant, of course, not only was it for Abram, it's for us. We're included in this covenant. First, he says, I want to make a great nation of your descendants. Here we are now, 4,000 years later, and we all know of the nation of Israel. These are the descendants of Abram. Now, they're not the faith descendants. We're the faith descendants because we accepted the Messiah. But there are Messianic Jews in Israel who believe in Jesus, who worship like we worship. And so there are some Jews, descendants of Abraham, both in blood and in faith. And so that does exist. Notice that he'll say, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make your reputation great. 4,000 years later, we still talk about the faith of Abraham. And you'll be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, but I'll curse those who curse you. We're going to see that today. A lot of times people don't know, why is this story being told in the text? And the answer is, it's an illustration of what just happened. Okay? Let me give you an example. Luke's gospel. Jesus is approached by a rich young ruler who says, I want to know what I need to do to be, to inherit the kingdom of God. And Jesus interacts with him and finally says to him, you need to sell everything you have, give to the poor, and come follow me. And the man can't do it. And then Jesus goes on to say it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. And of course we know it's Dr. Luke because he uses the word for surgical needle, not a sewing needle. Fascinating little aspect there. Matthew and Mark both use the word for a sewing needle. Luke changes it because he's a doctor to a suture needle. Fascinating little insight. But he says it's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to go to enter the kingdom of heaven. And the disciples come up and said, then who can be saved? I mean, if that's the case, can rich people not be saved? And the very next story is about a man by the name of Zacchaeus, a rich tax collector who is saved. In other words, after having given the teaching, Luke immediately tells a story that illustrates the possibility. With God, all things are possible. So a lot of times in the text, it's that way. You'll have a teaching, then you'll have a story that illustrates it. That's what's fixing to happen here. We're fixing to see Abraham blessed and a man cursed who had done Abraham not wrong. Wrong because Abraham had acted wrong. But still, God cursed him because he was messing up the plan of God. We're going to see that. And then notice the last part. Through you, all the people of the earth will be blessed. And we are the ones right now in this auditorium 4,000 years later because God blessed Abraham and through him came Jesus, and we're now followers of the faith of Abraham. Okay? That's the part that Paul teaches very clearly over in the book of Romans. Now, notice John 8. This is one of my favorite texts. People ask me all the time, do people in heaven know what's going on down here? And the answer is some of it. I can't say they know everything, but they know some of it, the part God reveals to them. This is a quote from Jesus, John chapter 8, a fulfillment of the messianic promise in Genesis 12, verse 3. Okay? This is the fulfillment of it. Look at what Jesus said. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. In other words, he says, Abraham longed, rejoiced. God, are you going to let me see when you fulfill your promise? Are you going to let me see the Messiah? And look at what Jesus said. He saw it and was glad. And of course, they said, you're not even 50 years old, and you know Abraham. No, they misunderstood what Jesus was saying. What Jesus was saying is that the spirit of Abraham that resides in the presence of God, like all of God's people who are saved, God allowed him to witness the coming of the Messiah. So how much does God allow the dead to know? I don't know that. I don't know that. But God at least allows them to see some of it. And so when people say, you know, is my loved one aware of what's going on down here? Possibly. Some of it. All of it? Maybe not. I like to say to people at funerals, you know, I wish my loved one could just seen how many people were here. And my response is, they may have had. We don't know what God allows. Now, you know, if two people show up for my funeral, and I'm up in heaven going, Lord, how many's at my funeral? God's probably going to say, let's move on to some other topic. Okay? So sometimes God probably does it, sometimes he does. All right, God's covenant with Abram will be developed further as the story develops. The Abrahamic covenant comes in stages because Abraham's faith is going to grow in stages. We're fixing to see that. Let's watch it illustrated. All right. And by the way, this is in Genesis 15 where you have this literal making of the covenant. By the way, the word covenant, to make a covenant, literally in Hebrew means to cut a covenant. Okay, the word is cut. And the reason for that is when you entered in a covenant in the ancient world, the way you did that was by killing animals. Okay? You would kill a bull, you'd kill a lamb, you'd kill a goat, you'd cut it in half, you'd put one piece on this side, one piece on this side, and then the two parties of the covenant would go between the dead bodies, pledging their loyalty to the covenant. Now, aren't you glad we don't do that when we get married? Could you imagine? No wedding cake? Not a wedding cake, but we got a lamb cut right smack in half. Half of it's over here, half of it's over here, and the groom and the bride's going to walk right between it, and that's how they're going to be married. Now, it's a little weird for us. In the ancient world, that's the way they made covenants. We'll see that in Genesis 15. So Abram left Haran. He and Terah and all the family had moved from Ur of the Chaldees up to Haran, way up north, from up the Euphrates, Tigris River Valley. And they settled there because Terah, his dad, is an idol worshiper. He's a pagan worshiper. He worships very likely the moon god Sin, S-I-N. And so they've gone up there. His dad dies, and he continues the journey from Haran. Notice this. Abram was 75 when he left Haran. He leaves from Haran to go down into the promised land. Abram took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the servants he had acquired while living in Haran. Then they set out to go into the land of Canaan. Abraham was a very good whatever it was that he did. Whether it was sheep, cattle, goats, I don't know how he earned money, but he earned a lot, okay? He comes into the land a fairly wealthy man. Nowhere near as wealthy as he's going to be. We oftentimes depict Abram as having, you know, a tent, Sarah, you know, here they come, a couple of servants. No. In fact, at one point in time, Abraham's whole clan is going to number probably, and I'm talking about servants, their families. Everything Abraham owns is going to be like 400. And so to see Abraham as this individual with one tent, with a few people, is a misnomer. That's not the Abram of the Bible. He's a wealthy man. He's got a lot of servants. They're married. They have kids. All of these are traveling together. So you need to picture that. And so they set out. When they arrived in the land of Canaan, Abram traveled throughout the land to the place called Shechem, as far as the oak of Moreh. Now here's a map. I don't know if you like maps. Many years ago, I was being interviewed at the end of the year by my elders, and one of their requests, if you can believe this, was, Les, could you quit using so many maps? And I guess I had several map haters in the eldership, okay? For those of us who like to visualize things, maps are helpful. Now, my precious wife probably doesn't care for maps. June and I have always been grateful for the arrival of GPS, because trying to read a map can sometimes be challenging for the best of us. And so maps are sometimes helpful, sometimes not. You see Ur of the Chaldees way over here in the south. Some people place it even further to the Persian Gulf. We don't know for sure where Ur was, or Ur as they called it. This is where Abraham was born. They went up the Tigris Valley. Notice modern-day Baghdad over here. The Tigris Valley, people go, why didn't they come straight across? This is Saudi Arabian and Jordanian desert. You didn't travel across that back then. You can't get across through there. You're like, well, they could stop at the gas station, right? Yeah, exactly the point. No water, no food, and so they would not go across this area. They would go up the Euphrates Valley and then come down the coast of the Mediterranean. So they go up to Haran, way up here in the north. Then they head south, and they're going to come to Shechem. By the way, Damascus was in existence back then. The Damascus that exists today is the longest existing city in the world. Damascus has always been inhabited. It's the only city from the ancient world that still exists. You know, Babylon is gone. Ur is gone. I mean, all of these ancient cities are gone. Even Jerusalem was destroyed for a while. Damascus, you can still go today in Damascus. And if you remember in the book of Acts, Saul of Tarsus is told to go to the house of a man on Straight Street. You can drive down Straight Street 2,000 years later. Still there. Still a street. Okay? So Damascus existed back then, still exists today. An amazing city. So they come down to Shechem. Now Shechem is located up in what is today modern day, or in New Testament time, it was where the Samaritans lived. Okay? Shechem would be right in the middle of these two hills. Now these two hills are the hill of blessing and the hill of cursing. Okay? These were the hills that Joshua went to, divided up the Israelites, put half of them on one side, half on the other, and there they would read out the law. He would read out the blessings. He would read out the curses. Half of Israel would say yes to the blessings. The other half would say no to the curses. This is where the woman at the well was. Okay? This is where that event happened. This is Mount Gerizim over here. Mount Gerizim is where the Samaritans built their temple. All right? Very symbolic to the Samaritans. This is Mount Ebal, two of the most important mountains in all the Old Testament. And so Abram comes here. Of course, it wouldn't have been any city. This is modern day Shechem, large city still there. And so he came to this area. It would have been mostly woods at that time. A lot of timber in Israel at that time. And notice one of the things that's said here, he stays at the oak of Moreh. A lot of a particular type of oak tree there in the land at the time. Very large. Not there anymore because of the need for firewood over the centuries. All of it was cut down. But notice Genesis 12, verse 6. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Now, if somebody says at that time, Native Americans were in the land, he's obviously writing in past tense. This is one of the examples I've mentioned to you that when people say to me, who wrote the book of Genesis? Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. I don't know. Well, I thought Moses wrote it. Moses wrote the law. God gave Moses the Torah. He wrote down the Ten Commandments. He wrote down the laws that are contained in the book of Leviticus, in the book of Deuteronomy, in the book of Exodus. He wrote those laws down. He didn't write the stories. You say, how do you know that? Because whoever's writing this is writing looking back when the Canaanites inhabited the land. When Moses lived, the Canaanites were still in the land. So this is obviously looking backwards. And by the way, as I've mentioned before, Moses' death is recorded in the last chapters of Deuteronomy. I don't know of many people that record their own death. All right? That's a little hard to do. And so it's not a lack of belief in inspiration. Whoever wrote the book was inspired. I just don't know who finished it. They took the stories of Moses and they edited it so that it was one continuous long storyline. Okay? I talked to Rodney last week, and Rodney said, you know, it could have been Joshua. He said it could have been Samuel. Could have been as late as Ezra after the exile. We just don't know when the Holy Spirit inspired the final writing of these first 5 books of the law. Okay? So, is Moses the author of the law? Yes. Is Moses the author of the first 5 books? Only the parts that are of the law. Somebody else authored the rest, and you see that through these little hints, and these pop up all over the place, okay? They'll say, for instance, used to this city was called such and such. Now it's called this. I mean, people are constantly looking back in time. If I come across a letter written to someone, and it says, sincerely yours, 1796, Nashboro, Tennessee. Somebody signs at Nashboro, they're not living in the 20th century, okay? It's Nashville. But at one time it was known as Nashboro. A lot of stuff is like that in the Bible as well. All right. Notice these large trees. Let me go back. I want you to notice this. As far as the oak of Moreh, okay, that's in Shechem. Look it over in the book of Joshua. I mean, we're talking about now almost 1,000 years later, okay, maybe 800 years later. On that day, Joshua, let me go back. Let me backtrack that. This is not 1,000 years later. Yes, it is. Let me go back. I'm getting mixed up just a little bit. I'm trying to get those dates. Abram lived around 2000 BC. Joshua was around 1300 BC. So this is 700 to 800 years later. But notice what he says. On that day, Joshua made a covenant for the people, and they're at Shechem, same place Abraham is. He reaffirmed for them the decrees and the laws. Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. Notice Joshua was writing some of it. Then he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak. Now you say, same oak? I don't know. I doubt it. If it is, it's an 800-year-old oak. But we know that there are some trees that are incredibly ancient. By the way, you go right across the Kidron Valley in Jerusalem today, you go into what's called the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, is that the original Garden of Gethsemane? We don't know. But here's what we do know. There are olive trees there that were alive when Jesus was walking in Jerusalem. Olive trees that are over 2,000 years old. So some of these trees over there live a long time, and this oak may have done that, but we still see there's oaks near Shechem 800 years later. All right? Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I give you this land to your descendants. So Abram built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. There's that covenant. I'm giving all of this land, you see, to your descendants. Not to you, to your descendants. Only piece of land Abram ever owned was where he was buried. He bought a cave of Machpelah, and there he buried Sarah, and then he was buried there later. Only piece of land he ever owned in the land. Now, is the land his? Yes. But it's his in anticipation of what's coming. All right? So that's the point that he's making. From there, Abram traveled on to the hill country east of Bethel, set up his tent with Bethel on the west, Ai on the east. There he built another altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram traveled on, continuing into the Negev. What's Abraham doing? He's looking at his land. I mean, he's just traveling through the land. God says, I'm giving this land to your descendants. And so what's Abram doing? Same thing you do. You know, if somebody said, hey, guess what? You've just inherited a farm. You got 1,000 acres over, wherever. Wouldn't you want to go and walk through all of it, look at all of it, see what you had? You know? June and I own about 9 acres of her family farm down in Mississippi. I like to go down there and walk around those 9 acres occasionally. Still can't find where all the boundaries are, but I like to try. And so Abram's walking through the land. Now he's going down. Notice he's near Bethel. Let me give you that. Here's another map. From the Mediterranean over to the Dead Sea is only about 55 miles. One of the things you've got to remember about Israel is Israel's a tiny country. If you go from the Kentucky state line to the Alabama state line, that's about as big as Israel is. Okay? It's not a giant nation. It's a nation of a few hundred miles. Okay? And across it, you see, it's just 55 miles, and this is at one of the wider points. And so you're not talking about, the state of Tennessee. Tennessee is way much larger than the nation of Israel was. So you need to keep it in perspective. Bethel and Ai, notice, are there in the hill country. That brown there represents the hill country. Jerusalem would have been about right here. Bethlehem right down here. Bethel and Ai are both near Jerusalem, just north of Jerusalem. Bethel literally means Bet-El. Bet means house. El means God. So Bethel means house of God. When Jacob flees from his brother Esau, he will stop at Bethel, house of God, and in his dream, guess what he sees? A staircase going up to heaven. Okay? And so Bethel is yes. And by the way, Jacob wakes up and says, surely this is the house of God. Now, some of y'all are saying, no, it was a ladder. I know it. We sang as children, Jacob's ladder. It wasn't a ladder, folks. It was a set of steps, okay? It was like what you would have outside your house to go up on top of your house in the ancient world, except this one led up to the presence of God. So, and by the way, you remember Jacob saw angels coming down the steps and going up the steps. And so he has this beautiful dream of God's people at work. And then he goes down to the Negev. I love the Negev. I'd love to have 1,000 acres of that, wouldn't you? I mean, it's some of the most desolate, God-forbidding part of the ancient world. I mean, you're like, can anything survive there? Yeah, if you've got a few sheep or goats, you can kind of find some little, what they call wadis. There's a wadi right there, and you see a little green grass in that wadi. So if you have 15 or 20 sheep, you could go down that wadi, and there'd be little pools of water, and they could get it. But most of it's just this right here. And by the way, that's the most amazing thing about all of Israel, is you start in the south, and that's what you get. By the time you get to the very north, you're at Mount Horeb, one of the highest mountains in the Lebanon mountain chain with snow always on the top of it. I was over there 5 years ago. We're driving up through the Galilee, and I look and I see this mountain with snow on the top. And I yell out to our guide, is that Mount Horeb? And he said, yes. He said, good eye. So up in the north, mountains with snow on it, cedar trees on it. In the south, this is what you get. And everywhere in between, everything in between. Everything from mountains to coast to valleys to beautiful place to plant orchards. And then you come down to the Dead Sea, and they call it the Dead Sea for a reason. Everything's dead. Okay? So a very interesting landscape in Israel. Notice verse 10, there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to live because the famine was so severe. Here's the story. Famine enters, no rain. Got to go somewhere where you can get food for your livestock, for your family. And Abram heads toward Egypt. And by the way, the road that came down along the coast was called the way of the sea. And so if you were coming up from anywhere in the Tigris-Euphrates River, you would come up north, you would start down through what is modern-day Lebanon, and you'd come right along the coastline, and you would go all the way down into Egypt, which is, by the way, where the Ethiopian eunuch was. He started his way going through Gaza. Gaza still, by the way, is still there today. Palestinians run the Gaza Strip. Gaza is a little strip right along the Mediterranean between Israel and Egypt. Still there today. And so all these years later, we still talk about Gaza. And so Abram heads through Gaza down into Egypt. And then look what he says. Look, I'm aware that you're a beautiful woman. Sarah's 65. But they lived to be Abraham 175. And so this is still not even quite midlife for them. And she's a beautiful woman. And Abram says to her, when the Egyptians see you, they'll say, she is his wife. Then they'll kill me, but allow you to live. Now, what God wants us to do is to pause here and ask a question. Anybody know what question God's wanting us to ask? What's the question we need to ask? Where is the faith of Abram? We call Abram the man of faith. God just said to him, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. Kind of hard to make a great nation if you did, right? I mean, I want you to think about this. God had just promised to Abram a great nation. And I'm going to bless those that bless you, curse those that curse you. And just as soon as the famine comes, they head toward Egypt. And what does Abram demonstrate? A lack of faith. Now, this is important. This is in here for a reason. It's there for you and me. Because I don't know about you, but sometimes my faith wavers. Sometimes I have doubts. Sometimes the promises of God are not as secure as other times in my mind. Abram was the same way. And by the way, not only is Abram not trusting of God, what else is he not? He's not protective of his wife. I want you to think about that. And by the way, she's not only his wife, but she's what else? His sister, half-sister. She's family. And here's Abram going, whoo, you're going to have to lie, because if you don't lie, they're going to kill me. I mean, can y'all imagine me saying that to June? Baby, we're going to Mississippi. You're a beautiful woman. They're going to kill me and take you, so you need to tell everybody you're not my wife. You're my sister. And I can just see June going right now, yeah, in your dreams. Primarily because she wouldn't want to be associated with being my sister, okay? I get where that's going. And so they head down, and notice what happens. Again, where's Abram's faith? Please say that you are my sister, so things will go well for me for your sake. That way you'll be saving my life. I'm not worried about your life, Sarai. If they take you, whew, fine, as long as I live. Look how bad it is. And so they go down. So Abram was entering Egypt. The Egyptians noticed how beautiful Sarai was, just like he knew they would. When Pharaoh's officials saw her, they brought her to the attention of Pharaoh. Now, the pharaohs of the ancient world were always older men. And so that a man in his 60s and 70s would see a woman in her 60s as being beautiful is only natural. And so Pharaoh, they see her and said, boy, Pharaoh would love this woman. And so notice they took the woman, Sarai, to Pharaoh's palace. The intentions are clear. We've got you another wife. In the ancient world, kings had whole harems of women. And Sarah was to join that group. And so the question is now, what's God going to do? God, what do you do in this case? Abram has lied. He's not trusted you. He's asked his wife to lie, and he's allowed his wife to be taken, and no idea what's fixing to happen to her. So God, what are you going to do with Abram? I think the problem with a lot of us is that we look, if we did the same thing, and we'd say, yeah, he's going to send us to hell. He's going to wash his hands of us. He's going to say, you've fallen away. You low down, no good, ungrateful person. I made a covenant with you, and you're doing this. I think a lot of us was raised to believe that. A lot of us was raised to believe that if we struggled with sin, God wouldn't love us anymore. That if we messed up, God wouldn't save us anymore. I mean, that somehow one sin would cease to make us children of God. I know I was raised that way. I still remember as a teenager thinking, boy, if I ever sin, I'm a goner. Until I confess and pray and ask God. And I still remember thinking, if I ever get in a head-on collision, I hope I have just enough few seconds to say, God, I'm so sorry. In Jesus' name, amen. Get that prayer in for forgiveness before you had the head-on collision. Why? Because otherwise you'd be lost. I don't know how we got there. I don't know how perfectionism for all of us became the norm, because I knew for a fact it wasn't in my life. And you probably knew for a fact it wasn't in yours. Y'all, we're not saved because we're perfect. We're saved because who's perfect? Jesus, right here. I'm never saved by my perfection. I'm saved by His perfection and by His grace. Abram's fixing to experience this. Watch what happens. He treated Abram well. This is his future wife's brother. And look at what Pharaoh did. So Abram acquired sheep and oxen and male and female donkeys and male and female servants and camels. Even got camels. And so you look here and you're like, okay, so Abram lies and he gets rich. Yeah. And you're like, that's odd. Yeah. By the way, what is it? It's God's being faithful to His covenant. It's God saying, even when you mess up, I'm not going to. I promised you I would take care of you, and I'm going to take care of you. And so God begins to just pour blessings into Abraham's lap. Now, Abraham's already a wealthy man, but nothing like what he's fixing to be. Now he's got herds and flocks and camels. He's got slaves to take care of them, servants to take care. Abraham's going to come up out of Egypt as a powerful, wealthy sheik in every sense of the word. You got to see this. And then God steps in to protect Sarai. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Now you look at this and you go, God, this is not fair. This is not right. What in the world's going on here? And the answer is Pharaoh's a pagan. Pharaoh's not a worshiper of God, doesn't respect God. He thinks he can take anybody he wants, and he just takes them and pays off their brother, and hey, everything's fine. And God goes, no, it's not. And not only is that not right, you're not allowed to take anything and everything you want. I don't care if you are Pharaoh. Not only is that not right, but you don't touch my holy people. Now, I know you're thinking like I am, but he's not holy. He's a liar. He won't stand up for his wife. He's getting rich while his wife is fixing to be violated. Abram, what are you thinking? And God says, give him some time. He'll get there. One day he'll get there in a way that blows everybody's mind. And if you don't remember the story of God coming to Abraham many, many, many years later and saying to Abraham, I got something I need you to do. I need you to take your son, your only son, go to the mountain I'll show you, and sacrifice him there and worship to me. And the man who lied about his wife looked toward heaven and said, yes, Lord. And did it until God stopped him. And that's why it gives me hope. Faith that was so weak over here. God says you don't get there overnight. It's going to take a long time to get up here. And God worked with him through the whole process. So watch what God does. He afflicts Pharaoh. Pharaoh calls Abram in. What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her as a wife for myself? Now get out of here, take her and get out. You want to talk about angry? Of course he's angry. Man, I don't know what kind of plague they have. I don't know if they had, boils on them. I don't know, tumors on them. I don't know what it was. But I know this, Pharaoh wants them out of there. And he's not going to say, and I want all my gifts back. He's so scared of Abraham's God that he's like, and you can take everything you got with you. And Abram's going to come out, y'all, with Sarah never having been violated. And here's what I love the most. Saying, maybe I can trust his word. He said he would bless me. He said he would curse those who cursed me. And now he's done it. Yeah. And that's what we see. I'll bless those who bless you, and I'll curse the one who curses you. So Pharaoh assigned men to Abram. They're even going to escort them out, make sure nobody hurts them. They escorted him, his wife, and all that he had out of the country. And Genesis 13 begins with these words. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. And look at verse 2. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock, in silver, and in gold. I mean, we're not talking about a man who's poor here. We're talking about the Bill Gates of his day. He's come up, and by the way, again, he's not coming up 10, 15 people. He's coming up hundreds and hundreds of servants, flocks, herds, camels. I mean, people carrying treasure chests of gold, silver. You need to picture the scene. I mean, he's got enough people here that he can rally an army if he needs to. And not only that, the God of Israel, well, not yet Israel, the God of Abraham is protecting him. And so he comes up, and God's done exactly what God said he would do. That's why that story is so important. Because he makes the promise in the first 3 verses and then illustrates it in the rest of the chapter. Now, we come to the next text now. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came back to Bethel. So he goes back to the house of Yahweh, or God, to the place between Bethel and Ai where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. And there Abraham called on the name of the Lord. He goes back and he worships. I mean, he goes back and he realizes, man, my God's been so faithful. And just like people did back in the early chapters of Genesis, he calls on the name of the Lord. I mean, can you picture him as he goes back to Bethel and he says, God, I didn't trust you. I didn't believe you. I lied. Sarah lied. We didn't think you would take care of us, and Lord, you have. And you've taken care of us beyond belief. This is unreal. Can we pause for a moment? Are we living in any different period of time of God's blessings? I think sometimes we fail to realize how blessed we are, how rich we are. We're the richest generation that the world's ever seen. I mean, yes, Abraham was richer than we are, but not by much. I want y'all to think about how much God has blessed us in the few years our family's been around. My grandmother and granddaddy got married in 1932. She was 14. My granddaddy was 17. They owned no land. They didn't own a house. They eloped and got married as teenagers. My grandmother barely a teenager. They moved in with their brother and sister. My granddaddy's brother married my grandmother's sister. We do that stuff in Mississippi. Maybe some in Tennessee. Double first cousins, in the family. Eventually, my grandfather on my grandmother's side gave them a house. It was a house none of us would live in today. It was a wooden structure with 2 fireplaces, outhouse in the back, well in the back to draw water from. No lights, no electricity, no air conditioning, only heat from the fireplace. Granddaddy used to talk about how he'd go and work all day long when he was in his 20s and make $0.25 a day. $0.25 a day. My grandmother said, yeah, we were given a bed by your grandparents, your great-grandparents on your granddaddy's side, and my mom and dad gave us a wood stove to cook on. That's how we got started. Grandmother got up every morning and milked a cow. She used to tell me, she said, I'd take a bucket and I'd put your daddy. You see, my daddy was born a week before my grandmother turned 15. I'd take your daddy, put him on a milk bucket, take your uncle, put him straddle of your dad and say, now, H, you hold on to your brother while I milk this cow. Every morning of every day of their young lives. She'd come back and take the milk and put it in the spring to keep it cool. Didn't have a refrigerator. She'd take the cream and make butter out of it. That's how they lived. They had a cow. Well, soon got some pigs. June and I don't live that way. By the way, they got around on a mule and a wagon. June and I will live here in a few minutes, 2 generations away. We'll get in a car, and we'll drive to a restaurant, and people will serve us lunch. And then we'll drive home, a house that's warm. Don't have to cut any firewood. None. Don't have to do any of that. And by the way, June doesn't milk cows. I don't think June's ever milked a cow, to my knowledge. I did for about one day and decided I didn't like it. You see, instead of a cow, we got something called Kroger or Publix, right? I mean, y'all think how far we've come. I mean, God says, I want to give you nice homes. And we live in some of the nicest homes in the world. We're warm in the winter. We're cool in the summer. We drive in incredible cars. I mean, y'all think about the cars. You get in your car, if it's cold, you know what you do? You mash a button and it warms your seat up. My grandmother didn't have a buggy with a seat warmer in it. That's how far we... And by the way, some of y'all now have seats that if you're hot, you turn on and they got air conditioners in the seats. I still haven't been convinced I want that. Okay? But when I look at what we have, and June and I celebrate and give God thanks, we go, you know what? We got money in the bank. We've got good jobs. We've got nice clothes. God has blessed us beyond our imaginations. And of course, it's all because we deserve it, right? No. Because we serve a good God. And so this text right here reminds me, we serve a God who we owe all of our worship to because He's blessed us beyond all the imaginations of the people before us. I remember last year when we gave as a church. I was never so proud of being part of a church. Last year we gave above and beyond in the month of December our weekly budget. We gave right under $250,000. Don't tell me God hasn't blessed us. And so thank you. Thank you for being a part of this church. Thank you for being God's people. Thank you for serving Him and worshiping Him and giving Him all the praise because He deserves it all. Next week, Lee will be back. Are y'all out? Y'all are gone one weekend, Joan. Okay, in the middle of December. I knew Lee had wrote me a note and said, hey, I am going to be out this date, but Lee will hopefully be back, nurse him back, get him back to health, and we look forward to him and Rodney as well and Juanita being back with us. Let's pray and we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you for the story of Abram and Sarai. Oh, what a marvelous story. And Father, they began slow. Their faith was weak, in fact, sometimes non-existent. And yet, Father, you kept blessing them because you made a promise to them. You've made similar promises to us. And Father, even more so through Jesus Christ our Lord. Oh, you've made us your children. Thank you, thank you, thank you.